In this exercise, we are going to take one data set and perform a series of CVP calculations. To get us ready for our calculations, there are a couple of totals that we need to figure out right off the bat. The first thing is total variable cost per unit, which we will add up together to get $17.50, and the other amount is total fixed expenses, which add up to $290,100. We're going to need these figures coming up in a minute here. The other thing we need to address is abbreviations that I'm going to use in my equations in order to take up less space and save some time. Sales revenue will be abbreviated SR, variable costs as VC, contribution margin as CM, fixed costs as FC, and operating income as OI. Now we're ready for our first calculation, which is contribution margin per unit. To calculate contribution margin per unit, you take the sales price and subtract the variable cost per unit. So we'll look at our data set, find the sales price per unit, which is $20, find the variable cost per unit, which we calculated at $17.50. Take the difference and you arrive at contribution margin per unit of $2.50. Next, let's calculate the contribution margin ratio. The formula for this is to take the contribution margin per unit, which is the result in our prior calculation, and divide it by the sales price. So I will take $2.50 and divide it by the sales price of $20 to get contribution margin ratio of 0.125. Now let's move to the next question, the total contribution margin at our regular volume. So if you go back up on our data set to the top, you can see that the regular monthly volume is 130,000 units. So let's now go back down and figure out how to calculate the total contribution margin dollars when we sell 130,000 units. And the way I'm going to calculate that is to take the contribution margin per unit, which was the result of step number 1, and I'm going to multiply that by 130,000 units. And that gives me $325,000. Now we can go to question 4, which is operating income when sales are 160,000 units. The first thing we need to do here is think about what the contribution margin income statement formula is. Sales revenue minus variable costs equals contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income. Since we know that sales revenue minus variable costs equals contribution margin, we can rewrite the equation in a shorter format by just saying that contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income. We're going to use the short equation in order to solve this question quickly. The first thing we need to do is calculate total contribution margin when sales are 160,000 units. We're going to do that just like we did in our prior question. We're going to take contribution margin per unit of $2.50 and multiply it by 160,000 units this time to get total contribution margin at 160,000 units. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we arrive at $400,000. Then we just need to subtract total fixed costs, which we calculated right at the beginning before we started working on our questions. Total fixed costs are $290,100. So we'll plug that in, subtract it from our contribution margin to calculate operating income of $109,900. Now we'll move to our final question that we're answering, which is the operating income when sales are 4.5 million. So the first thing we need to do is remember that we're going to use our shortcut formula to calculate operating income, which is contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income. So our first step should be to calculate total contribution margin when our total sales are 4.5 million. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the result of our second calculation, the contribution margin ratio, 0.125. If I multiply that ratio by the sales amount of 4.5 million, then that gives me the total contribution margin when sales are 4.5 million. And the result of that calculation is $562,500. That's our total contribution margin. But to arrive at operating income, we need to subtract total fixed costs, which we previously identified as $290,100. So we take contribution margin of $562,500, subtract fixed costs of $290,100 to get to operating income of 272,400. And this concludes our first set of CVP calculations.